Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're in round 13 of our coverage of the 2018 Canada's tournament with 14 total rounds. This is coming down to the very end. Fabiano Caruana led for most of the tournament, and then Sergei Karyakin, who won this thing 2 years ago, came storming back and beats Caruana in the last round to go tied with Caruana on the same number of points, but he does have the tiebreaker, which is going to be how you did against that individual you are tied with. So if they stay at the same points, Karyakin will be victorious. Karyakin in round 13 did tie his game. So we're going to be looking at Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces against Aronian with the black pieces. Caruana really needs to get this victory. He has the black pieces tomorrow for the last and final round. So if he does not get a victory here, he's going to have a miracle tomorrow. His opponent, one of the strongest players in the world, but not having the tournament that Aronian would like to. He is in last place and looking for something. So we'll go ahead and get started. A lot on the line for this particular game. Starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5. Knight f3, knight c6, getting into the Rai Lopez. Bishop here to b5. Pawn to a6, bishop back to a4. Knight to f6, castle on the king side. Pretty much the common lines that we're used to seeing lately. Bishop here e7, rook to e1, pawn to b5, pushing the bishop back here to b3. And then after castle on the king side, pawn to d3, pawn d6. And then bishop to d2. And this is not the most common line that we see. This is starting to get into the martial attack from white. Many times you'll see pawn to c3 right away. Bishop to c2 is a move that we actually saw from Alexander Grishuk last round when he played Levon Aronian. Grishuk had the white pieces. Levon Aronian played the black pieces. He has to play back-to-back rounds as the black pieces in this same opening. Now, the one thing that you'll notice is they had a day off yesterday. So after round 12, Fabiano, as you can guess, he studied Levon Aronian's gameplay just to see how he would approach not only all the games, but particularly this variation as well. While they did draw that game in the last round, Fabiano spent the full day off looking and said he really liked this bishop here to d2 move, so that's what he played in the game. Bishop down here to g4. In the previous game, Levon Aronian played king here to h8 against Grishuk, but did some additional studying, and the computers recommended that he played bishop to g4. So that's exactly what he did. Now pawn to c3, and this is more of the anti-martial attack. Pawn here to d5, and Caruana's not looking to take this pawn in the center. He has the option, could always do that, but that's not what he's looking to do here. Many times white will avoid that in the center just because it gives black a strong attack. White's not looking to give black a strong attack in this game. So pawn to h3, forcing the bishop to come back here, and then queen to e2. If you're curious, what this would look like, I'll go over some variations. After queen to e2, maybe rook to b8, and then bishop to g5. But if we were to see the pawn take here on d5, the knight takes on d5, pawn up here to g4, forcing the bishop come back to g6. Now the knight to e5, it is being protected by the queen and the rook here. Maybe the knight takes, queen takes, pawn down here to c6. Bishop captures, and then it doesn't really matter where it goes from here. White could decide just to come up, say, yeah, you can take my queen, I can take your queen as well. But at the end of the day, this is going to be pretty interesting from black's point of view. He has the bishop pair here, and this is going to be pretty fine for black. Not something that white wants to get into, with black having very, very good development as far as his bishops. His knight here on b1's not doing anything. All of the major pieces for black are very involved into the game. So as many players do, we see Fabiano decides to go ahead and not take this material. Instead, gets his dark square bishop involved into the game. Bishop up here to g5, and then we see Levon Aronian say, yeah, I'll go ahead and take that pawn. So pawn takes on e4, pawn recaptures, pawn here to h6, forcing the bishop to come back. Not really a good place for this bishop besides c1. You don't want to bring it back here to f5. It would just get, or f4 would be captured here. And then e3 is just blocking off the queen. And then d2, it's blocking off the knight here on b1. So comes back here to c1. We are 15 moves in, and at the press game afterwards, they were asking about his preparation for this particular opening because he really hasn't played this before. And Fabiano said that he memorized the first 15 moves for this variation. He didn't know exactly where his opponent was going to go with the bishop down here to g4 earlier instead of the king to h8, which Aronian played in the last round. But he was prepared for it, and up until this point really hasn't spent much time on the clock, knowing that this is a great position for what he's trying to do, and it was all memorized. So we go in from the no longer in the memorized book lines, and black continues with bishop back here to g6. Now white's going to get his other knight involved into the game, knight here to d2, and it's not going to be coming here to c4 or e4 as you can imagine. So the next place is going to be f1 because there's no bishop that's going to come down here and exchange off with this knight. So knight down here to f1, and it has a few options. Could always come up here to e3, could come here to g3, could even come over here to h2 and then maneuver to g4 if white wanted to. Knight to h5, knight here to f1. And then bishop down here to c5. This is really great square for Aronian as he is controlling these dark squares. And it does block off. The knight can't come to g3 as Fabiano might have wanted to. That would just be disaster. Knight takes, and the pawn can't take. It's being pinned down by this bishop here to the king. So that would be a huge mistake. So instead we see pawn to g3, which is an interesting approach on how white's going to get safety for his king. Because now he can just push forward with king here to g2. We see the black side, yeah, I'll go and do a similar type move and play king here to h7 and not have my king exposed back here on the 8th rank or being pinned down by the bishop here on b3, because both of these bishops are doing a good job of attacking these very, very critical squares here on f7 as well as f2. So king up here to g2 as we talked about, queen to e7, bishop down here to c2, adding another layer of protection on this pawn on e4. Rook over here to d8, and then pawn up here to b4. And there's a lot of options that white has here as far as how he's going to continue. I recommend not playing something like d1. If you want to counterattack in the center, this is not how you do it, because after the rook takes, bishop takes, then just rook over here to d8. Both of these bishops are not involved into the action. The rook here on d8 is controlling the long file, so not something you want to do right away. But if you look at some of the other options, you have knight to e3. This does block off the bishop from attacking down here. You also have something like bishop to e3. This is a move that I would be looking at personally because it says, hey, if you want to take, that's fine. I'll recapture with my knight here. This is the square I want to bring my knight to, get it very involved into the center. I bring it to any of these outposts right here, and I no longer have to worry about your very, very aggressive bishop up here on c5. Now, Fabiano did choose the better of all the options, and that is to play pawn to b4 and start attacking on the queen side. So kudos for him. As you can imagine, being one of the best players in the world, did find the best move, as many of the top GM commentators were going through and said, yes, a b4 is the best line. So bishop comes back to b6, pawn up here to a4, continuing the attack here. Knight to f6, just trying to get it centralized, wasn't doing much here on h5. All things considered, just trying to reposition at some point. That's exactly what he does. Knight here to h4, attacking the bishop. Queen down here to e6. Bishop to d3, wants to add even more attackers for this square here on b5. Now black plays bishop to h5, not looking to give up the bishop right away, and attacks the queen. Pawn up here to g4. Says, I'll block that with my pawn here. And the Aronian says, okay, I'll take that. Let's go all out. I'm in last place in the tournament. Who cares? I'll just try to go crazy. Bishop takes on g4. And so we start to see some crazy computation from both sides. Pawn takes here on g4. Knight takes on g4. Knight up here to f5 was attacking the bishop, but since it's not doing that, does want to bring it to this outpost here on f5. And then the knight takes on f2. Still being protected by the bishop on here on b6. So great little square. The king can't take, as you can see that. It's being protecting the queen. That would just be completely terrible. So the bishop comes back here to c2. Says, yes, I don't want to lose my bishop here. That's the one thing I have going for me. If I'm going to give up a lot of my pawns and I'm going to be stuck with mostly minor pieces, I want those minor pieces to work well together. So decides to go ahead and play bishop back here to c2, hold on to the bishops. Pawn to g6, as we usually see here, kicking back the knight. Knight comes up here to e3, and this is a great find because there's a few options that white can continue with this. He recognizes that this pawn is going to fall. He wants to take this knight right here, and so there's a couple ways to block this off. One is with the knight to e3. What happens here, though, is knight to h3. The queen is protecting it. Maybe knight up here to d5, attacking the bishop. Knight down here to g1, attacking the queen. Queen to d3. It's just kind of annoying. Still dealing with this bishop here on b6. Didn't really block it off at all. And the knight here on g1 is still hanging out. Now, if we come back and say, okay, what if we play knight to e3? That's exactly what we do in the game. Now, if the pawn takes here on f5, then the king can just take here. Fabiano did decide to go ahead and take with his pawn here on f5 first, knowing that he can take this knight if he wants to, but decided first to go ahead and take that pawn. If he takes with his king, I think this completely fine. King takes f2, pawn down here to f4, rook over here to h1, maybe rook to d6. I think this stops a lot of the threats that black could have, but Fabiano looked at it and said, I just don't even want to have to deal with that. Now I have this pawn and this bishop still attacking this long dark diagonal. So in the game, he decides to go ahead and first take. Pawn takes on f5, and then after the queen comes over here, since it is being attacked, now the queen takes on f2. No, doesn't even have his king on that long dark diagonal. And from here, pawn to e4. And Aronian, after the match, was asked about this position. While he has, especially after e4, he's in a tremendously bad position. One of his friends and colleagues that goes over the matches with him actually pointed out that he had the option of knight taking here on b4. And after the pawn takes, then the rook down here on d4. And as you analyze this position, which they did for a long time in the game, if you're watching Peter Svidler, he was going over these positions. Black is actually doing pretty well here. And he's controlling a lot of the center of the board. He can get this other rook involved into the game. This would be fine for black. Both Aronian and Fabiano both said they missed the fact that the knight could take here and then bring the rook down here. This would have been a fantastic play by Aronian. That's not what he played in the game. Instead, played pawn to e4. Doesn't really help his position too much. Rook over to h1, really starting a strong attack on the king side of the board. Rook to d6, bishop takes on e4. So now it has a very strong attacking bishop. He also has this rook over here, can swing his other rook. This bishop here on c1, as soon as this knight gets activated at some point, once the queen is no longer pinned down, can start to attack this h6 square as well. Rook to g8 check, king down here to f1, getting safety. Knight to e5, queen up to f6 or f4, also attacking the square here on h6. Pawn c6, that's not doing anything at all. Pawn takes on b5, rook down to g5, trying to just hold on the king side of the board, but also just giving up a ton of material on the queen side. So now we have a pass pawn here on a6. Queen back here to d8 says, I'll try to stop some of that, but it also just opens up the door for more attacking on the king side of the board. Pawn up here to f6, knight to g6, and then the rook takes on h6. And at this point, Aronian said, yeah, I will go ahead and resign. They asked him after the match if he was disappointed that he didn't find that knight taking here on b4. And he said, honestly, I just don't even care. As you can imagine someone saying that. They just have not had a good tournament. Seems like every single round he has lost. Started not too bad, and then just went completely south. Sometimes people ask, how would this game continue? If you were to take with his king, queen down here to h2, no real good way to stop this. This pawn here on f6 is doing a lot of work since the king can't retreat back there. So maybe rook to h5, knight to f5, forcing the king to move back here, since the bishop here on c1 is now attacking, as we mentioned earlier, this entire dark diagonal. So now the rook's going to fall. Things just get really, really bad from here. Knight up here to e7. This is a great outpost check. You can see how bad things get from here. So at the end of the day, Aronian said, I will resign. And Fabiano, he is now in the lead going into the last round tomorrow. He had it 2 years ago, had an opportunity to win the whole thing and did not. Slipped away from him. He will be looking to come tomorrow and have a strong performance. If he wins, then he is the winner. If he draws, then he will be looking for Sergei Karyakin to draw as well, because Karyakin could win. Karyakin has the white pieces in his game. If he gets the win here and they are tied, remember Karyakin will get the victory, will win back-to-back candidate tournament. So it's going to be a huge day tomorrow. Be looking for some analysis, but if you do want spoilers from that, you can watch some live action throughout different sites. So I'll be checking that out live, but we'll be doing another video as well, as you can imagine, from round 14. So thank you guys for following along. It has been a fantastic tournament. I'm curious to see who's going to win and see how they will fare against Magnus Carlsen later in the year. See you guys in round 14.